The dying child whispered one word more, and a mafia boss collapsed on his own kitchen floor. But that wasn't the real shock. The real shock came later, when Franco found an unsent letter hidden in his dead wife's study. And in that letter, written in Elena's own handwriting, was a name, the name of the cleaning woman he had just thrown out into a storm. His wife had known. She had planned this. The woman scrubbing his floors wasn't a stranger. She was the one person Elena trusted with everything, including her child, her husband, and her final goodbye. Our channel tells stories where mafia worlds collide with love, where secrets outlive the people who kept them, and where family is rebuilt from the most unexpected pieces. Elena's love reached across death to protect the people she left behind. That kind of love deserves to be shared. Hit like, leave a comment, share this video with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe, because every story on this channel carries a message someone out there needs today.
Franco's knees were pressed into the cold marble, but he didn't feel it. The cold that should have penetrated his Italian suit pants was nothing next to the fire blazing inside him. He attempted to get up, but his legs wouldn't obey. 23 days without sleep, watching his daughter weaken like a dying flower, and yelling at doctors had left him empty. He grabbed the doorframe, his knuckles turning white, and slowly pulled himself upright. The scent surrounded him like a ghostly hug: mint, chicken broth, star-shaped noodles. In that moment, Franco wasn't in his $3 million kitchen anymore. He was transported 3 years into the past, on a Sunday, entering the small service kitchen Elena used as her own. She was at the stove in an apron over her expensive dress, stirring a worn-out pot that seemed to belong in a second-hand store. The smell had filled the tiny room with herbs, slow cooking, love, and hardship. Franco had turned up his nose. "Why are you making that cheap stuff? We have a chef for a reason." Elena had faced him, her dark eyes gentle and a slight smile on her face, because Lily has to learn what love tastes like, Franco, not just money. He had dismissed her with a scoff and then left the room. Now, standing in the doorway as that same aroma filled the air, Franco would have traded his entire criminal enterprise just to hear her speak those words again. The memory broke when the woman in the yellow gloves started to hum. It was a simple, old lullaby, the kind mothers pass down through generations when they have only their voices to offer their children. Franco didn't know the tune, but he felt a deep recognition in his bones. And Lily, his daughter who had been like a vacant porcelain doll for 23 agonizing days, did something incredible. A corner of her mouth lifted. It wasn't a real smile, not quite, but it was life. It was a crack in the tomb she had built around herself. Franco felt his breath catch. He had an urge to run to his daughter, hold her tight, and cry into her hair while pleading with her to stay with him. But his feet were stuck to the floor. He was terrified that any movement or sound would cause this delicate magic to break like glass. The woman in the yellow gloves would stop her humming, Lily would shut her mouth again, and that small spark of life would be gone for good. So Franco Castellano, the man who ordered hits without hesitation and built his empire on violence and fear, was trapped in his own kitchen, frozen by the sound of his own potential footsteps. A sharp voice shattered the moment. "What in the hell do you think you are doing?" Nurse Patricia Coleman charged into the kitchen from a side door, her phone in her hand and her face contorted with professional anger. She had witnessed the scene through the glass. The woman in the yellow gloves whipped around, her eyes wide with fear. The plastic spoon fell from her grasp and hit the marble floor with a clatter. Soup splashed onto the perfect white surface. Then she saw Franco, and all the color left her face. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. He saw in her eyes the pure, desperate fear of someone who is about to lose everything. But Franco wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Lily. His daughter was staring at the spoon on the floor, her small hand reaching for the spot where the woman had been. Her lips formed a word she hadn't said in 23 days. More. And for the first time since Elena's coffin was put into the frozen Chicago ground, a single tear traced a path down Franco Castellano's face. To grasp why that one tear held more weight than all the blood Franco Castellano had ever caused to be spilled, you have to go back 23 days to when his entire world collapsed. That morning, the Chicago wind felt like 1,000 icy knives. The sky was a low, heavy gray, as if it too was in mourning. Oak Hill Cemetery lay before the crowd, its gravestones sticking out of the snow like broken teeth. Franco stood by the open grave in a black Armani suit, his expression as hard as stone. He did not cry or shake. As a mafia boss who had buried his own father at the age of 12, he knew that tears were an indulgence the powerful could not permit themselves. Next to him, Lily held her mother's silk scarf, a pale blue one that carried the faint scent of Chanel perfume. Her little fingers squeezed the material so hard her knuckles went white. She watched the oak casket as it hung above the frozen ground, her dark eyes unblinking and vacant. The priest said words Franco couldn't hear. As the coffin was lowered, Lily didn't make a sound. She just seemed to turn off, like a light bulb going out. 1 second, a 4-year-old girl was beside her father. The next, only a breathing shell remained, empty and hollow. Franco saw it happen, but he didn't grasp its meaning. Not then. For the first 3 days, he chalked it up to shock. The psychologist had told him that children handle grief in their own way. Give her time, she will recover. On the 4th day, Lily wouldn't eat breakfast. The nanny offered her oatmeal, pancakes, and her favorite strawberry yogurt, but Lily just turned her head and faced the wall. On day 7, she refused to drink water. Her lips began to crack, and her skin became pale. Franco fired the nanny and brought in 3 new ones. On day 10, Dr. Harrison Webb, who had cared for 3 generations of Castellanos, put an intravenous line in Lily's small arm. Nutrients flowed into her veins as she lay still in her princess bed, surrounded by toys that couldn't make her smile. Day 14, day 17, day 20. Franco kept throwing money at the problem. Was like throwing gasoline on a fire. He brought in top child specialists from Johns Hopkins. He hired experts in nutrition, therapy, and even hypnosis. He filled her room with every toy imaginable, making it a wonderland, and offered her ponies, castles, whatever she wanted. Lily remained completely unresponsive. On day 22, Dr. Webb took Franco aside. The old doctor looked exhausted, and worse, defeated. Her body is shutting down, Mr. Castellano. This isn't a medical problem anymore. It's something else. Franco grabbed the doctor's coat, pulling him off the ground. I'll give you $10 million to save my little girl. Just name a price. Anything. Dr. Webb just looked at him with sad eyes. There are some things money can't fix, sir. Your daughter's will to live is one of them. That night, Franco stood by Lily's door in the dark and silent mansion, hearing only the steady beep of her heart monitor. He rested his forehead on the cool wood, whispering into the hall, Elena, are you trying to take her with you? Are you leaving me all alone? Only the beep answered, methodically counting down the last moments of his daughter's life. Franco Castellano was no ordinary man, and the empire he ruled was far from it. His mansion sat on Gold Coast Hill, a crown looking over its kingdom. It had 30 rooms on 4 floors, with giant windows that stared out at the gray waters of Lake Michigan. The building was a fortress cleverly disguised as a luxury home, with reinforced concrete hidden behind Italian marble and bulletproof glass in every window. Deep below the wine cellar, there was a bomb shelter. 20 armed guards were always patrolling the property. A network of surveillance cameras watched every single inch, all feeding into a control room that never shut down. Motion sensors protected the perimeter, and panic buttons were hidden under every table. This was the command center for South Chicago's criminal underworld. For 15 years, Franco had ruled with a firm but careful hand. His operations included gambling, loan sharking, and protection rackets. Not a single illegal dollar in the south of the city moved without him getting a piece. Rival families who dared to challenge him were now buried in unmarked graves or resting at the bottom of Lake Michigan. But even the strongest empires can rot from the inside. Ever since Elena died, Franco had ignored his duties. He missed meetings and didn't return phone calls. The line of his top men seeking advice slowly disappeared when they heard the boss was unavailable. Vincent Moretti, Franco's most loyal man for over 20 years, stood at the study door one night, his face etched with worry. "Boss, the Irish are making a move on the north side. They've already taken 3 of our gambling spots. The Russians are circling us too. They can sense we're vulnerable." Franco just sat in his leather chair, watching the security monitor showing Lily's room. His daughter was completely still in her bed, surrounded by the beeping and humming machines that were forcing her to stay alive. "Let them have it," Franco said, his voice empty. Vincent moved closer. "Boss, if we don't fight back, they'll see us as weak. All 15 years of our work." I said, "Let them have it." The words felt like a final judgment. In 15 years, Franco Castellano had never backed down. He had never appeared weak. He never let a challenge go unanswered. But what good was an empire if he had no one to leave it to? Every night, Franco would stand outside Lily's room, unable to bring himself to go inside. He'd place his hand on the door, feeling the soft hum of the machines and hearing the rhythmic beeps that proved his daughter was still breathing. He was terrified to open that door, scared he would find her gone, with the alarms blaring and the nurses rushing around a body that had already given up. So he stood there in the dark and did something he hadn't done since he was 12 years old, since he saw his own father die on a warehouse floor. He prayed, "God, if you can hear me, take anything you want. Take it all. Just please leave my daughter with me." The answer arrived on day 22, but it wasn't from God. The heart monitor suddenly screamed. The alarm sliced through the quiet mansion. Franco threw the door open, nearly breaking it off its hinges, shouting for Dr. Webb, for the nurses, for anyone. Lily's tiny body shook once, then twice before going completely still. 30 seconds of chest compressions, 30 seconds of Franco's entire world falling apart, 30 seconds of him pleading with every god he had ever dismissed. And then, a single heartbeat. Dr. Webb wiped sweat from his face, his hands shaking. "She's stable for the moment." He looked at Franco, his eyes heavy with a truth he didn't want to say. "You have about a week, Mr. Castellano. Maybe not even that. She is giving up." Franco collapsed to his knees next to his daughter's bed. He held her tiny, cold, and fragile hand, bringing it to his lips. "I'll do anything," he whispered. "No matter what it is, no matter the price." He had no idea that the solution to his prayer was already in motion. Right at that moment, 45 minutes away, in a run-down South Side apartment, in a world that felt like a different planet, a young woman sat on a worn-out mattress, counting her money. Aurora Hayes laid out the coins on the stained sheet. 3 quarters, 4 dimes, and 7 pennies, adding up to $1.22. That was every penny she had to her name. The room she was in was tiny, barely 15 square meters. Cracks ran up the walls like swollen veins. A large water stain marked the ceiling where rain always leaked through. Cockroaches moved freely in the corners, not even trying to hide anymore. The heater had broken 2 winters before, and the landlord no longer bothered to promise he would fix it. This was her home. On the small bed across from her, an old woman was propped up on pillows, her eyes hazy with Alzheimer's. Martha Hayes was 82 years old, but her mind was lost in the past. She looked at Aurora with a gentle, confused smile. "Sarah, is that you? Did you remember my medicine?" Aurora's heart ached. Sarah was her mother's name. Her mother had been gone for 12 years. "It's me, Grandma. It's Aurora." Martha's smile wavered for a second before becoming blank again. "Sarah, you were always such a sweet girl. Your father should be home from work soon." Aurora glanced at the change in her palm, then at the empty prescription bottle on the nightstand. Her grandmother's medication cost $47 for a 2-week supply. The cheapest food she could buy would be at least $15 for the week, $1.22. It was always a choice between medicine or food. It was never both. The decision was a familiar agony she faced every month, every week, and every single day. But it was not really a choice. It never was. 6 months ago, Aurora thought things couldn't get any worse. She was mistaken. The memory came back without warning. The cold floor of the free clinic, the humming fluorescent lights, and the blood on the floor. The loan sharks her ex-husband owed money to had tracked her down. They used their fists and feet to send a message, while she cried out for help that didn't come. When she woke up, the look on the doctor's face said it all. She had been 5 months pregnant with a baby she had secretly named. A baby she had whispered to in the night, promising a better future. Gone. Aurora didn't cry that night. She hadn't cried at all since then. She had no more tears to give. A knock on her door pulled her out of the memory. She opened it to a woman in a cheap suit holding a clipboard. The employment agency's logo was worn and peeling. Aurora Hayes, I have a job for you. A live-in domestic position. It's at one of those big houses up north. The pay is... The woman looked at her papers. Surprisingly good. In fact, it is 3 times the usual amount. Aurora looked at her suspiciously. What's wrong with it? The woman paused. The man you'd work for is... Well, his name is Franco Castellano. That name hit her like a punch. Everyone on the South Side knew that name and what it stood for, including the people he had buried. The mob boss. They liked to call him a businessman. The woman just shrugged. Listen, I have to inform you. What you decide to do with that information is up to you. Aurora looked over at her grandmother, who was now quietly humming a song to a child that was not there. She looked at the empty pill bottle, the pile of unpaid bills, and the eviction notice on the wall. When do I need to be there? Tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. After the woman was gone, Aurora knelt by her bed and took out a little wooden box from under a loose floorboard. Inside was a photograph, its corners softened by years of being held. 2 young girls were smiling in the sun, one with dark hair and one with light hair. They were cousins, best friends, and like sisters. On the back, written in a child's messy script, it said, Aurora, I will always be there for you. Elena Castellano. Her name had been Elena Reyes back then, before she married. She had married into a world of immense wealth and influence, a place Aurora could never hope to reach. This was Elena, who sent cash in secret letters. Elena, who never forgot her roots. Elena, who was laid to rest 23 days ago. Aurora clutched the photo to her heart, her whisper filling the silent room. I am on my way, sister. I am so sorry it took me this long. Aurora entered the Castellano property using the service entrance, a small gate concealed by a tall, manicured hedge, completely hidden from the main drive. The gate was meant to be overlooked, much like the staff who used it. As she walked onto the grounds, she gasped. The mansion stood before her like a palace from a forgotten era. It rose 3 stories high, a structure of white stone and shining windows against the overcast Chicago sky. The front yard was bigger than her entire neighborhood. Fountains of Italian marble were dry and silent in the cold air, waiting for spring. Her tiny apartment could probably fit into the foyer alone. A woman dressed in a starched black uniform appeared from a side entrance. Her silver hair was in a bun so severe it pulled at her features. She held a clipboard and eyed Aurora with an expression of instant disapproval. You must be the new hire from the agency. It was a statement, not an inquiry. I am Mrs. Irene Crawford, the head of housekeeping. You will call me Mrs. Crawford. Aurora gave a quick nod. Yes, Mrs. Crawford. The woman walked around her, sizing her up like a show horse. She grabbed Aurora's hands abruptly, inspecting her palms, fingers, and nails. Are your nails clean? Do you have any contagious illnesses? A police record? No, ma'am. I have none of those. Mrs. Crawford jotted a note on her clipboard, her lips forming a tight, displeased line. What she found so unsatisfactory, Aurora couldn't guess. Maybe it was just Aurora herself. Come with me. The mansion's interior was even more breathtaking. The marble floors were so polished that Aurora could see her own troubled face reflected in them. She was a phantom in this sanctuary of riches, wearing worn-out shoes and a threadbare coat. But beyond the opulence, something felt terribly off. A heavy, cold silence filled the air, pressing in on her. There were no voices echoing in the grand halls. There was no sound of movement, no sign of anyone living there. The mansion was less a home and more a beautiful, lifeless tomb. Mrs. Crawford showed her into a small utility room and gave her a navy blue uniform that was a size too big, along with a pair of garish yellow rubber gloves. These are the rules, Mrs. Crawford stated, her voice as brittle as thin ice. You will not look Mr. Castellano in the eye. You will not speak to him directly. If you see him coming, you make yourself scarce. Hide in a closet. Step into another room. I don't care. Just be gone. Aurora nodded without a word. And the most important rule of all, Mrs. Crawford said, moving closer until their faces were inches apart. You are forbidden from entering the East Wing. The child's room is located there. Do not go near it. Do not look toward it. Do not even let it cross your mind. Do you understand me? Yes, Mrs. Crawford. The housekeeper observed her for a moment, looking for any hint of resistance. Seeing none, she gave a sharp nod. Your tasks for today. You will scrub the guest lavatories. Then you will mop the service hallways. After that, you will polish the kitchen windows. Start now. In a storage room filled with the scent of bleach, Aurora changed into the uniform. The material was loose on her slender body, and the yellow gloves made a squeaking sound. She saw her reflection in a grime-covered mirror. She looked completely anonymous, a nobody. That was good. She was accustomed to being unseen. The next few hours were a haze of cleaning and polishing. Aurora worked quietly, unnoticed by the other staff members who walked by without a second look. She was almost done mopping near the east end of the hall when a sound reached her. A beep. It was the steady, mechanical pulse of a medical monitor. The noise came from behind a closed door down the forbidden corridor. Aurora's grip on the mop tightened. Then she heard voices, two nurses whispering nearby. It's been 3 days since she last cried. That is a bad sign, a very bad sign. I know. When a child goes silent like that, it means they are losing hope. A knot of ice formed in Aurora's chest. She remembered her own baby, the child who never took a single breath, never saw the light of day, never let out a first cry. The baby she lost on the cold floor of a hospital while indifferent people walked past her. Her child hadn't cried either, because some farewells are completely silent. The confrontation she was warned to avoid happened just 3 hours into her shift. She was on her hands and knees in the grand foyer, cleaning the marble floor with a worn-out brush. A bucket of dirty, soapy water was beside her. Her back was aching and her knees were sore, but she continued her work, silent and invisible as instructed. The main doors flew open with a bang. Franco Castellano entered like a storm in human form. His face looked as if it were chiseled from stone, his jaw set so firmly that a muscle twitched in his cheek. His eyes were red from lack of sleep and circled by shadows as dark as bruises. He had just left another appointment with Dr. Webb, which meant more terrible news. It was another step in a tragic countdown. Aurora noticed him a second too late. She hurried to collect her things and disappear as Mrs. Crawford had ordered, but her movements were clumsy and slow. The toe of Franco's $5,000 handmade Italian leather shoe clipped the side of her bucket. Soapy water sloshed onto the perfect marble. A few drops hit his shoes, staining the expensive leather like dark, spreading bruises. The ensuing silence was deafening. Franco froze. He stared down at his ruined footwear. Then his eyes moved to Aurora, who was still kneeling on the floor, the brush held tightly in her hand. He looked at her with the same disgust one might have for an insect on their food. "Who allowed you in here?" His voice was low and controlled, which made it far more frightening than if he had yelled. Aurora tried to speak, but only a faint sound came out. I am so sorry, sir. I am new. I did not see—" "Mrs. Crawford." He didn't have to raise his voice. The head housekeeper appeared almost instantly from a nearby hall, her face white with fear. "Mr. Castellano, my deepest apologies. She is a new hire." Franco simply raised a hand, and Mrs. Crawford went quiet. "Explain the rules to her," he commanded, each word landing with heavy finality. "And find her some different shoes. The squeak of rubber on my floors is like nails on a chalkboard." He started to walk away, and Aurora finally let out a tiny, shaky breath. But then he stopped. "And Mrs. Crawford," he said without turning around, "keep her away from Lily. I refuse to have my daughter breathe the stench of poverty these people bring in from the streets." The insult struck her like a physical blow. Aurora remained on the floor, her gaze fixed on the wet marble as his footsteps receded into the vast house. A distant door slammed shut, followed by an oppressive silence. Mrs. Crawford loomed over her, her stiff posture radiating pure disappointment. "Clean up this mess, then you will report to the service area for a new assignment." The housekeeper turned and left, leaving Aurora alone with the dirty water and the sharp burn of his contempt. Slowly, Aurora lifted her chin. She stared down the hallway where Franco had gone, her eyes filling with tears that she refused to shed. She had been called far worse things. She had endured much worse treatment. Yet something about his casual disdain, the ease with which he had written her off, ignited a fire inside her. Existence stung more than she had anticipated. Yet she remembered Elena's voice from a letter written years ago. Aurora knew the words by heart from reading them so many times. "Franco has a kind heart. It is just buried very deep." Aurora held back her tears and picked up her brush. How deep was too deep? And was there anything left under all that ice worth finding? It was 3 o'clock in the morning. The servants' area was shrouded in darkness, but Aurora could not sleep. Her mattress was thin and uncomfortable. The room was freezing. The heating system clearly did not reach this forgotten part of the mansion. She curled up under a blanket that smelled of mothballs, just staring at the ceiling. She had to move, to get some air. Aurora got out of bed and crept into the hallway. At night, the mansion became a different place. Shadows collected in the corners. Moonlight sliced through the tall windows, and every creak sounded like a ghostly whisper. That is when she heard it. Not the steady beeping of medical machines. This was something else. It was singing. The voice was raw and unsteady, cracking on each note. It had no real melody, just pure desperation turned into sound. Aurora followed the voice to the forbidden east wing. The door was slightly ajar, with a dim light leaking into the hall. She peeked through the opening. Franco Castellano was hunched over his daughter's bed, his wide shoulders curved inward, his spine bent like an old man broken by grief. The powerful mafia boss who had treated her like trash now seemed like a hollow shell. He was singing a lullaby. The words were jumbled, and the tune was impossible to recognize. He obviously did not know the song, and had probably never sung to his daughter before Elena passed away. But he was trying. Lily was motionless, her small frame barely making a bump under the blankets. Her skin was stretched thin over bones a child should not have showing. In her little hand, she held a silk scarf, pale blue with a fancy letter E stitched in the corner. Elena's scarf. Franco's voice broke into silence. He gently pressed his lips to his daughter's forehead. "Please don't leave me, Lily." His whisper slipped through the crack in the door. "Daddy can't survive without you." His voice quivered like a child afraid of the dark. Aurora stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the sob building in her throat. This was not a monster. This was a father watching his child slip away. She ran back to her room, tears rolling down her face, She knew this kind of pain. 6 months ago, she had been singing lullabies too, not to a child in a bed, but to a growing belly that carried all her dreams. Then there was blood, followed by the silence where a heartbeat should have been. Franco Castellano was losing his daughter. Aurora had already lost her own, and in that mutual sorrow, an unspoken connection formed between them. It was day 23, late in the afternoon. Aurora was tasked with cleaning the kitchen windows, the very kitchen where her life was about to be upended. She stood on a small ladder, her yellow rubber gloves squeaking on the glass as she wiped in slow circles. Down below, a drama unfolded that she was meant to ignore. Nurse Patricia Coleman sat in front of Lily's high chair, holding a spoon full of a gray nutritional paste. The child sat perfectly still. She was like a wax doll with empty eyes staring into space. The medical machines around her beeped a steady rhythm. "Lily, you have to eat." Patricia's voice was flat, containing no warmth, only professional annoyance. "If you don't eat, the tube goes back in. You remember the tube, right? It's not pleasant." Lily did not blink. She did not move. She gave no sign she had heard anything. Patricia tried again, moving the spoon toward the little girl's closed lips. The paste smeared across Lily's mouth, untouched and unwanted. The nurse wiped it off with cold efficiency. "Fine, be that way." Patricia's phone buzzed inside her pocket. She glanced at the screen, then at the child, and back at her phone. With a frustrated sigh, she put the spoon down and stood up. "I'll be right back. Don't you go anywhere." The attempt at a joke hung in the silent kitchen. Patricia walked out the side door, already putting the phone to her ear. Aurora's hand stopped moving on the window pane. She looked down at Lily, really looked, for the first time since she arrived. The little girl was skin and bones. Her skin was pulled tight over her sharp, angled bones. Her dark hair was limp and lifeless. Her eyes, which were bright in the photos Aurora had seen around the mansion, were now as dull as rocks. Then, Aurora noticed it. A single tear made its way down Lily's pale cheek. It was silent and unwiped. The child didn't cry or sniffle or make a sound. There was just that one tear, cutting a wet path through the paste on her skin. It was a voiceless tear. A pain tightened in Aurora's chest, and her eyes welled up. 6 months ago, she had been on a hospital floor, bleeding and alone, invisible to the people who walked around her. Nobody stopped. Nobody seemed to care. She had lost everything in silence, surrounded by people who saw nothing worth saving. She saw the security camera's red light blinking in the corner. She looked at the door Patricia had just used. She looked at the child who was slowly fading away in her high chair. Aurora climbed down the ladder. Her body moved before her brain could object. She went to her bag, which was in a corner of the service hall, and took out a plastic container. Inside was her lunch, a chicken soup with star-shaped noodles and fresh mint. It was her grandmother's recipe, the same one she and Elena had learned as kids, standing on their toes in a tiny kitchen that smelled of love, not money. Aurora knew what would happen if she were caught. Mrs. Crawford would fire her on the spot. She would lose her job, the money for her grandmother's medicine, everything. She looked at Lily again. The child was frozen, that one tear still shining on her cheek, waiting for nothing. Aurora had already watched one child fade away in silence. Her own baby, the one she never held. She could not let it happen again. Not this time. Never again. She opened the container, and the warm smell of mint and chicken broth filled the cold kitchen like a quiet prayer. Franco stayed on his knees, with tears flowing freely down his face. The most feared man in all of Chicago was kneeling on his own marble floor, crying like a little boy, unable to look away from his daughter. Aurora was frozen next to Lily's high chair, the plastic spoon still dripping soup onto the spotless floor. Her heart pounded in her chest. Every part of her was screaming to run, to vanish, to become the invisible person she was hired to be. But her legs would not obey. The side door flew open. Nurse Patricia rushed back into the kitchen, phone still in her hand. She saw the scene. Franco on the floor. Aurora stood over the child, a strange soup, a fallen spoon, and a look of pure professional fury on her face. Mr. Castellano, Patricia's voice was sharp. This woman fed your daughter something I did not approve. I have no idea what is in that bowl. It might be spoiled. It could be poison. Franco's tears vanished, his jaw set like stone. He got to his feet, a storm building in his eyes. Aurora's heart went cold. This was the moment she feared. The rage of a mafia boss aimed at a nobody who dared to touch his dying child. Franco started walking toward her. Every step sounded like a hammer blow. Aurora backed away until the refrigerator stopped her. She looked down, waiting for him to yell or strike. She was not sure which would be first, but Franco didn't look at her. He looked right past her at Lily. The little girl was doing something she had not done since her mother's funeral. Her small arm reached out, her fingers trying to grab Aurora, closing on nothing, more. The words slipped. From Lily's chapped lips, just a faint whisper. Please. Franco forgot to breathe. That tiny, weak voice he thought he would never hear again. The voice that had been gone for 23 days, lost in a grief too big for a 4-year-old to carry. His daughter had spoken. Franco slowly turned to Aurora, his eyes red and exhausted. He studied her face as if truly seeing her for the first time. Where did you find this recipe? Aurora's voice was shaking. It was my grandmother's, sir. Your grandmother. Franco's look became more intense. Where was she from? West Side, sir. We were raised there. The words settled in the room like lead weights. West Side, the place where Elena was born. The same streets she knew before money and a new life gave her marble floors and expensive dresses. Franco just stared at Aurora. Something in his eyes changed, from suspicion to a desperate hope. He turned to Mrs. Crawford, who now stood in the doorway, looking lost. This woman stays, Franco said, his tone leaving no room for argument. From this moment, her only job is to take care of Lily. Patricia's jaw dropped. Mr. Castellano, this is completely out of line. I have to object. You are fired. Franco didn't even look her way. Get your things and go. Mrs. Crawford stepped in. Sir, are you sure about this? She is just a cleaning girl. I said she stays. Silence filled the entire kitchen. Aurora stood perfectly still, trying to understand what just happened. A few moments ago, she was just the invisible girl washing windows. Now, the most powerful man in Chicago was putting his daughter's life in her hands. Then Lily did something that shocked everyone. She smiled. It was small, fragile, just a tiny curve of her pale lips, but it was real, the first smile in 23 days. In the days that followed, the Castellano mansion started to change, slowly, almost without notice, like the first thaw of spring. Aurora's first defiant act was opening the curtains. Thick velvet had kept Lily's room dark since the funeral, trapping sadness inside. Aurora pulled them open, and warm afternoon sun poured into the room for the first time in almost a month. Mrs. Crawford almost fainted when she found wildflowers in a glass on Lily's nightstand. Simple daisies and dandelions, picked from the edge of the lawn, their bright yellow heads next to machines that tracked heartbeats. Those are weeds, they will bring in bugs, the housekeeper complained. Aurora just smiled politely and left them there. Every day she made the same simple soup, chicken broth, simmered for hours with tiny, star-shaped pasta. Fresh mint from a plant she asked for. Every day she sang the old lullabies her grandmother had taught her. The very same songs Elena once knew. Tunes passed down through women who had only love to offer. Lily started to come back to them. On the first day, she ate half the soup. Her eyes followed Aurora around the room. By day 3, a hint of pink returned to her cheeks, where only gray had been for weeks. On day 5, she spoke a full sentence. Aurora, tell me a story. Aurora told her about 2 girls who grew up on the west side, catching fireflies in glass jars and dreaming of faraway castles. She never mentioned the other girl's name. She didn't have to. Franco saw all of it. In his office, security camera feeds covered the walls, but he only watched one screen, the one in Lily's room. He watched Aurora on the floor, building forts out of pillows with his daughter. He watched Lily laugh, a real laugh. The sound was faint through the speakers, but it was there. A sound he thought had died with Elena. Franco wanted to go in there. He wanted to open the door, get on the floor with his daughter, and join the magic Aurora was creating. But his feet felt glued to the floor. Something stopped him. Maybe it was pride or fear, or a feeling he did not want to admit, jealousy. He was jealous of a cleaning woman, jealous of how she reached his daughter when all his wealth and power could not. That night, Franco stood outside Lily's door, like he had so many nights before. But this time, instead of beeping machines, he heard singing. Aurora's voice came through the wood, soft and gentle, singing an old lullaby. Lily was already asleep. He could hear her soft, even breaths. For just a second, Franco let himself lean against the door and just listen. Then he heard footsteps in the hall. Vincent came around the corner, his face serious. "Boss, you have a visitor. Margaret Whitmore is here." Franco's face grew dark. Margaret, Elena's mother, the woman who never liked her daughter's poor friends, who tried to erase every sign of Elena's simple past. She never came to visit without a reason, and her reasons were always selfish. Margaret Whitmore walked into the mansion like she was queen. At 62 years old, she looked perfect, with platinum blonde hair cut short and sharp, and a Chanel suit that cost a fortune. South Sea pearls hung around her neck like a trophy. Her heels clicked on the marble floor like a ticking clock. Every step was a reminder of her status. "The security is getting ridiculous," she said before Franco could say a word. "I was forced to wait at the gate for 7 minutes. 7 minutes, Franco. And nobody bothered to tell me my own granddaughter was well enough for visitors." Franco clenched his jaw. "I did not know you were on your way, Margaret. A grandmother does not need to make an appointment to see her grandchild." Her gaze moved across the entrance hall, looking for anything out of place. "I heard from my sources that Lily was doing better. I want to see her right now." Franco thought about saying no. He knew this visit would only cause problems. But Margaret was Elena's mother, and she did have legal rights as Lily's grandmother. "Follow me," he said with no emotion. They walked up the grand staircase without a word. Margaret's strong perfume followed them like a poison cloud. Franco took her down the east wing, toward the room that had been a silent tomb just days earlier. He pushed the door open. The scene inside made Margaret freeze. Aurora was on the floor, her hair messy, her uniform stained with paint. She held her hands up like monster claws, making a funny, scary face and growling softly. And Lily was laughing. The sound filled the room like tiny bells, clear and happy. It was the laugh of a child who had forgotten what sadness was. She held a stuffed rabbit and reached for Aurora, asking for more. "The monster is coming for you," Aurora growled, crawling toward her. Lily squealed with joy and fell back on a pile of soft pillows. Margaret's face twisted, not with happiness, but with pure disgust. "What is this?" Her voice cut through the joy like a knife. "Why is a servant playing with my granddaughter?" The room fell silent. Aurora quickly got to her feet, trying to fix her stained uniform, looking at the floor. "Ma'am, I was not talking to you." Margaret ignored her completely. "Franco, you will explain this to me now." Lily's laughter had stopped. She looked at her grandmother with big, confused eyes, then slowly moved until she was behind Aurora's legs, her little fingers grabbing the maid's uniform. She did not go to her grandmother. She hid from her. Margaret saw it. The rejection was as clear as a slap to the face, spread across her perfectly powdered face, her lips forming a thin white line. "Franco, my study, now." She turned and stalked out of the room, leaving a chill in the air. In the study, with the door shut and the room heavy with tension, Margaret began her attack. You hired some random girl to look after my granddaughter, a child with Whitmore blood? Do you even know who this woman is? Did you do a background check? Check her references? Franco stood by the window, looking out at the gray Chicago skyline. He did not say a word, because he had not checked. He had not asked a single question. He had just watched his daughter eat for the first time in 23 days and made a choice from his heart, not his head. Margaret's eyes narrowed. I see. Well then, allow me to handle the investigation for you. The next morning, on Margaret's orders, Franco called Vincent to his study. The oak-paneled room felt unusually small, filled with tension. Margaret sat in a leather armchair like a queen expecting a report, her manicured nails tapping on the armrest. Franco stood by the window, with his back to the room, seeing clouds build over Lake Michigan. Vincent came in with a manila folder clutched in his hand. Do you have the report? Margaret asked before Franco had a chance to speak. Vincent looked at his boss, who gave a sharp nod. Then he opened the file. Her name is Aurora Hayes, 28 years old, born and raised on Chicago's West Side. He turned a page. Her father passed when she was 5. His heart gave out from being overworked at the meatpacking factory. Her mother remarried 2 years later to a man named Dale Simmons. This Simmons had a police record for being drunk and disorderly, domestic abuse, petty theft. A smirk of satisfaction formed on Margaret's lips. Go on. The mother died from cancer when Aurora was 16. They had no funds for medical care. Vincent paused, his voice getting softer. The girl ran away from her stepfather that year. She was homeless for a time, taking odd jobs, waitressing, cleaning, factory shifts, anything she could get. Franco stood still by the window, but his shoulders had tensed up. She got married at 24. Her husband was Derek Cole. Cole was a gambler with ties to Southside loan sharks. He ran up a $50,000 debt, and then he vanished, leaving her to pay it. Margaret leaned in. So, she is indebted to criminals. How wonderful. Vincent's jaw grew tight. There is more. 6 months ago, the loan sharks located her. They assaulted her violently. She was 5 months pregnant at the time. She lost the child. A heavy silence filled the room. Even Margaret was speechless. Vincent shut the folder. She is now the only one caring for her grandmother, Martha Hayes, who is 82. The woman has advanced Alzheimer's. Her grandmother's medicine uses up almost all of Aurora's earnings. She is late on her rent, late on her utilities, late on everything. Margaret was the first to speak, her voice thick with poison. You see, Franco? Debt, gangsters, a woman who has nothing left to lose. What could she possibly want from our family, from our wealth? Franco finally turned away from the window. His face showed no emotion. It was like a stone mask. But deep in his eyes, a storm was brewing. He thought of another woman from the West Side, one who was a waitress when he first met her, who wore clothes from thrift stores and dreamed of a better life. A woman Margaret had loathed from the minute Elena brought her into their home. His wife, the one true love of his life, the mother of his child. Does she have any criminal history? Franco asked in a low voice. Vincent shook his head. It is clean. She does not even have a parking violation. She is just, he paused, trying to find the best description. She is just a person who has had a lot of terrible luck. Franco moved to his desk and sat down with a thud. He tented his fingers under his chin, looking at a picture of Elena that seemed to watch over the entire room. Aurora will stay, he declared. This is my final word. Margaret shot up from her chair, her face red with anger. You are going to regret this, Franco. You just wait and see. She strode to the door, pulling it open much harder than she needed to. In the hall outside, Aurora was holding Lily's hand, guiding her to the garden. The little girl was talking excitedly, pointing at something outside the window. Margaret stopped, her gaze locked on the two of them, the poor girl and the Whitmore heiress, acting just like a mother and her daughter. A cold, cruel, and calculated smile spread across her face. An idea was already taking shape in her mind. The 3 days Margaret was at the estate were 3 days of deliberate agony for Aurora. It started with simple acts of cruelty. Margaret scrunched her nose when Aurora served Lily some soup. "What is that stench? It smells of the gutter. Can you not prepare food that does not bring a shelter to mind?" Aurora did not respond. She just carried the bowl to the kitchen and returned with another, which was exactly the same. During dinner, Margaret made Aurora stand by her chair, like a servant from an old story, to pour her water, get her napkins, and listen to her constant complaints. The older woman never said Aurora's name, calling her that woman, or the help, or just flicking her bejeweled hand dismissively. Aurora tolerated it all because of Lily. But the thing that made Margaret the most furious was beyond her power. Lily would not go anywhere without Aurora. If Margaret tried to touch the girl, Lily would pull away. If Margaret presented pricey toys and promised shopping sprees, Lily would just shake her head and cling to Aurora's legs. When Margaret attempted to read her a story at bedtime, Lily would demand Aurora instead. The rejection felt like swallowing poison to Margaret. On the third day, she put her scheme into action. "You there," Margaret called to Aurora, from the parlor. "I need your assistance. The latch on this necklace is jammed." Aurora went to her, feeling wary. The South Sea pearl necklace was radiant on Margaret's throat. It was a strand of glowing orbs worth more money than Aurora could hope to earn in 10 lifetimes. "Turn yourself around," Aurora said quietly. "I will see if I can unfasten it." Her fingers worked on the tiny clasp. In a moment, it came free. "There, it is undone." Margaret took the necklace off and glanced at it. "Very well, you can leave now." Aurora went back to Lily, who was busy drawing at her little table near the window. She gave the matter no further thought. 15 minutes later, a shriek broke the calm. "My necklace!" Margaret's scream ricocheted through the house like an alarm. Staff hurried in from all over. Franco came out of his office, his expression filled with alarm. "It is missing." Margaret was standing in the middle of the foyer, her hand on her bare neck. "My South Sea pearl necklace. It is worth $200,000. It has been stolen." Her eyes scanned the servants, then focused on Aurora with chilling intensity. She was the last person who had it. Check her. A cold dread washed over Aurora. "I did not take it. Search her this instant." Mrs. Crawford came forward, her expression serious. "Miss Hayes, I must ask you to show me what is in your pockets." Aurora's hands shook as she put them into her apron, the very one she had worn all day, the pocket that held only a handkerchief and a ribbon for Lily's hair. Her fingertips brushed something cold and smooth. She pulled it out. The strand of South Sea pearls poured from her pocket, shimmering in the light, unbelievably gorgeous, and unbelievably incriminating. Mrs. Crawford let out a gasp. Margaret's face twisted in a look of victory. "There, do you see? A common thief." "I knew it the second I laid eyes on her." Aurora just stared at the pearls in her hand. She had not stolen them. She had not even held them after taking them off Margaret's neck. But none of that was important anymore. She looked at Franco, hoping to see the man who had cried in the kitchen, the man who had given her his daughter to care for. He met her gaze. His eyes were cold, hard, and unreadable, replacing the warmth that had been there before. Franco started walking toward Aurora, every step on the marble floor sounding like a nail being hammered into a coffin. His gaze shifted from the pearls that were swinging, from her shaking hand, to her face, which was pale, scared, and pleading, and then to Margaret, who was dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a silk cloth, faking a grief she did not have. A battle was raging in his mind. Reason yelled at him. The proof was undeniable. The necklace was discovered in her pocket. She had debts. She had a clear motive. The file Vincent had given him showed a picture of desperation, of a drowning woman who would grab onto anything to stay afloat. But another, quieter voice whispered beneath all that noise, a voice that recalled how Aurora had knelt with his daughter, singing soft songs that smelled of mint and magic. Margaret's voice broke through his thoughts. "Call the police, Franco. This woman is a common criminal. She deserves to spend years in jail for this." Franco's jaw clenched. The scandal would be in all the papers. The Castellano name would be a tabloid joke. His rivals would relish the turmoil. "No police," he stated. His voice was empty, lifeless. "I will not have news crews all over my estate." He turned back to Aurora. Their eyes locked, his guarded and frigid, hers filled with a desperate plea. "You have 5 minutes to leave this property." The words felt like rocks shattering glass. "Sir, I beg you." Aurora took a step, her voice cracking. "I did not steal it. I swear to you. I could never. I put my trust in you." Franco's sharp voice cut off her desperate words. "I gave you my own daughter, and this is how you repay me." "I did not. You have 5 minutes, starting now." Aurora was paralyzed, the pearls still held loosely in her hand. Mrs. Crawford came over and took them from her grasp, treating them like holy objects that had been dirtied by an unworthy person. With slow movements, Aurora untied her apron. She folded it perfectly, a last show of self-respect as her world fell apart, and placed it on the marble table. She began to walk to the main door. Then a piercing scream echoed through the house. "Aurora, no!" Lily was at the top of the large staircase, in her bare feet, her face stained with tears. She had overheard it all through the air ducts of the old mansion. The little girl raced down the stairs, almost falling, her small legs moving as fast as they could. She threw herself against Aurora's legs, holding on with all her might. "Do not leave me, Mommy. Please do not go." Aurora's breath caught in her throat. "Mommy." The word just hung in the air, both a prayer and a curse. Franco just stared at his daughter. His daughter, who had not called anyone Mommy since Elena passed, was clinging to the cleaning woman as if she were the only stable thing in a collapsing world. His heart cracked, then shattered into pieces on the marble floor. Margaret saw her chance. "Do you see?" Her voice was laced with poison. "She has brainwashed the girl, taking advantage of a grieving 4-year-old for her own benefit. This woman is a threat, Franco." Franco looked at Lily's tear-streaked face, at Aurora's shaking hands, and at Margaret's triumphant smile, poorly hidden behind fake concern. The pressure was coming from every direction. Doubt was clouding his mind. Fear was choking him. He did what any cornered animal would do. He lashed out. "Get out!" The word exploded from his chest. "Get out of my house! Now!" Aurora flinched, as if she had been slapped. Gently, very carefully, she unhooked Lily's fingers from her legs. The little girl screamed, reaching for her, but a maid quickly appeared and lifted Lily up, carrying her away as she struggled. Aurora walked to the door. She opened it. Outside, rain poured from a black sky in sheets. Thunder rolled across. The storm raged outside like a battle. Aurora was pushed out into the tempest. The massive wooden door crashed shut, silencing Lily's cries and leaving Aurora alone in the downpour. She had no coat, no cash, and no place to go. So she stepped into the night, the rain instantly drenching her uniform, with absolutely nothing left to her name. Just 3 hours after Aurora was forced out, the Castellano home fell into chaos. It started with a high temperature. Lily's fever shot up to 104 degrees within an hour. The medical staff Franco had sent away was urgently called back. They discovered the little girl shaking uncontrollably, her body seized by tremors that defied medical explanation. Suddenly, she went completely still. Dr. Webb tirelessly tried to save her, his experienced hands monitoring her condition and giving her useless medicine. The machines blared their constant grim alarms. Staff murmured worriedly in the hallways, sharing fearful looks. By the middle of the night, Lily was unresponsive, her breath faint, her skin pale and waxy. Franco remained at her side, holding her small hand tightly in his own. His hands were shaking so much he could hardly hold on. The powerful crime boss was now just a broken man, seeing his child fade away once more. Dr. Webb confessed, his voice heavy with fatigue and bewilderment. "I just do not get it." She was stable, actually getting better. But after that woman departed, it all fell apart. He just shook his head. It was like her will to live just vanished again. Franco was silent. He had no words. Lily's dry lips began to move, whispering words he could not make out. He moved in, putting his ear close to her lips. "Aurora, Aurora, Mommy." The names were a mantra from her delirious mind, a desperate plea even as she was dying. His daughter was crying out for the very person he had banished. Margaret, her grandmother, watched from a corner, her posture showing worried concern. But through his haze of sorrow, Franco saw a detail that shocked him. Her eyes told a completely different story. Beneath the mask of worry, he saw a flash of something cold, sharp, and pleased. A look of victory. The truth hit Franco like a physical blow to his gut. Why was Margaret not genuinely distressed? Her own granddaughter was on her deathbed. The last link to her deceased daughter was slipping away. And yet, under that act of anxiety, Margaret Whitmore had the look of someone who had just won. Franco let go of Lily's hand. He rose from his chair, his body protesting, feeling the full weight of his 37 years. Vincent, his trusted man, appeared from the shadows. "Boss, where are you headed?" Franco gave no reply. He walked out of the sick room, moving past the medical team, the buzzing equipment, and the portraits of his forefathers, whose legacy was built on violence and intimidation. His steps led him down the east wing to a room he had not touched since they laid his wife to rest. Elena's private study. He had locked it after the funeral and tossed the key. Inside, nothing had been changed. Her personal library, her pictures, her hidden life. Franco paused at the door, his hand shaking as he reached for the knob. He understood that opening this door meant confronting all the things he had been avoiding. The pain, the regret, and the reality of the woman he had just thrown out. And maybe, just maybe, some part of Elena was left behind with the answers he so desperately sought. His hand tightened on the handle. As the door creaked open, it was as if the ghost of Elena Castellano had reached out to him. Her signature scent was still in the air, faint and delicate, but clear. The smell of gardenias and vanilla had once felt like comfort and love. Now, it only spelled loss. Franco entered the study as if it were a sacred tomb. Everything was exactly as she left it. Her favorite novels were perfectly arranged on the shelves. Her art supplies sat on the desk, the brushes hard with old paint. Cherished family photos gleamed in their frames. Elena cradling a newborn Lily. Elena on their wedding day. Elena radiant in the summer sunlight. Franco traced the spines of her books, disturbing a thick layer of settled dust. He had no idea what he hoped to find. He just felt an overwhelming need for something of hers to help him navigate this terrible time. His fingers came to a stop on a small wooden chest hidden behind a collection of poetry. He carefully pulled it out and placed on his desk. The lid groaned as he opened it. Inside, a bundle of old letters was tied together with a faded ribbon. Franco's heart skipped a beat. He carefully untied the ribbon and laid the letters out. Most were to Elena from friends and family. But one envelope stood out. It was a letter from Elena that she never mailed. The address was for an Aurora Hayes on the south side of Chicago. A chill went down Franco's spine. His fingers trembled as he unfolded the paper. Elena's handwriting, so painfully familiar, seemed to speak to him from the past. "My dearest cousin, Aurora, I know you are going through a terrible time. I wish I could do more to help you, but Franco does not get it. He believes money fixes every problem. He has no idea that some wounds can only be healed by love, not by cash. I have been making Grandma's chicken soup for Lily. Do you still have the recipe? Star-shaped pasta, fresh mint, simmered for hours. Lily is completely hooked on it. When she is sick, it is the only food she wants. Nothing else ever works. Aurora, if anything should happen to me, I need you to find Lily. You are the only one I trust to love her like I do. The only one who gets where we came from, and what is truly important. Franco has a good heart. It is just buried very deep. But you will find it one day. I promise you. I love you, little cousin. I always will, Elena. The letter slipped from Franco's grasp, drifting to the floor like a fallen leaf. Aurora was Elena's cousin, her own family. The person Elena trusted more than anyone to raise her daughter, and Franco had just thrown her out. The truth hit him like a tidal wave. The soup, the lullabies, the immediate bond between Aurora and Lily. It was all because they were blood. They shared a past. They shared a grandmother who taught them both how to cook with love. Franco realized he had not just hired a nanny that morning. Fate had brought his wife's final wish right to his front door, and he had treated her like trash. A raw shout escaped his throat. "Vincent!" The door flew open, and his top man stood there, his eyes wide with concern. Franco was already moving, crossing the study in 3 long steps. "Find her. Find Aurora. Right now." Franco charged through the mansion's main entrance and into the violent storm. Rain stung his face like icy needles. Thunder roared from above, making the very ground shake. He didn't grab a coat. He didn't pause for a second. Vincent ran right behind him, yelling above the screaming wind, "Boss, let me get the car. You can't go out there by yourself." Franco paid him no mind. He raced for the garage, his expensive shoes sliding on the wet gravel, his $1,000 suit instantly drenched. He had his phone to his ear before he even reached the vehicle. "Mrs. Crawford, I need the personnel file for Aurora Hayes. I need her home address immediately." He listened, committed it to memory, then ended the call. Vincent barely got into the passenger seat as Franco slammed his foot on the gas of a black SUV. The engine screamed to life. The vehicle shot down the driveway before Vincent could even close his door. They tore through the storm like 2 madmen. The windshield wipers couldn't keep up with the downpour. Lightning briefly lit up the deserted streets in blinding white flashes. Franco's knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel, forcing the SUV through flooded intersections that would make any sane person turn back. Southside. The scenery changed dramatically as they crossed some invisible line. The fancy brownstones of the north were replaced by decaying apartment buildings. Streetlights either flickered weakly or were completely out. Potholes turned into massive craters. Suddenly, the road was gone. A deep, muddy river flowed across the street, making it impossible to drive any further. Franco slammed on the brakes. "We'll need to find another way," Vincent started to say. But Franco was already out of the SUV. He plunged right into the flood, wading through knee-high water that clung to his Italian shoes. The rain matted his hair to his head, mud splattered all over his ruined suit. He didn't even notice. He ran down the flooded streets, banging on doors, shouting at the shocked faces that appeared in the windows. "Aurora Hayes! Have you seen Aurora Hayes? Where does she live?" He got confused looks, doors slammed in his face, and suspicious glares. At last, an old woman in a worn-out shawl opened her door a crack. "The young lady with the sick grandma?" she asked. She looked at Franco, at his expensive suit now caked in mud, at the pure desperation in his eyes. "She got kicked out of her place last week. The landlord put her on the street. I heard she went to that old church down the block, the abandoned one." Franco took off running. The church stood at the end of a dead-end street, a decaying Gothic building with boarded-up windows and a collapsed roof. The main door hung crookedly on its rusted hinges. Franco shoved it open. Inside, it was completely dark. Rain pounded on the few remaining sections of the roof, dripping down from 100 different spots. Broken pews were scattered around like fallen soldiers. And there, in a corner, huddled by the altar, was a small figure, Aurora. She was soaked through, shaking uncontrollably, her thin work uniform doing nothing to shield her from the cold. She was clutching something tightly to her chest, a faded photograph, which she protected from the rain with her own body. It showed two little girls smiling in the sun. Franco walked across the ruined sanctuary and fell to his knees in front of her. The muddy water seeped into his pants, but he was beyond caring. "Aurora," he said, his voice cracking on her name. "I know. I found a letter from Elena. I know who you are." Aurora lifted her head, very slowly. Her eyes were red and swollen, and completely empty of everything but exhaustion and deep pain. "What is it that you know?" Her voice was a raw whisper. "That I am a thief? Or that I am the poor cousin Elena had to keep hidden from you because you would judge me just like you did that first day?" Franco bowed his head in shame. "I know I don't deserve to be forgiven," he whispered. "But Lily is dying. She is asking for you by name. Please," his voice broke. "Please come back home. She really needs you." Aurora just stared at the man kneeling in front of her, the feared mob boss of South Chicago, brought to his knees in the mud of her own childhood neighborhood. Rain and tears mixed on his face, impossible to tell apart. She was silent for a long time. She could almost hear Elena's voice from long ago. "Franco has a good heart. It's just buried very deep." She pictured Lily, her small hand reaching out, her chapped lips trying to form the word, "Mommy." Aurora finally closed her eyes. "I am not doing this for you," she said at last. Her voice was surprisingly strong, despite the cold that chilled her to the bone. "I am coming back for Lily, and for the promise that I made to Elena." Franco nodded, his head still lowered. "I understand." He stood up and offered her his hand. After a brief pause, Aurora took it. They rode back through the storm without saying a word. The rain started to let up as they reached the rich northern part of the city, as if the sky itself respected the invisible line between the classes. The mansion was lit up against the dark morning sky when they pulled up. It was 4 in the morning. Aurora didn't even wait for the SUV to come to a complete stop. She jumped out and ran inside, rushing past surprised servants, up the main staircase, and down the east wing to Lily's bedroom. The little girl was lying completely still in her bed, with beeping machines and worried nurses all around her. Her skin was as white as a sheet, and her breathing was weak and uneven. Aurora crossed the room in 3 steps. She got into the bed and gently pulled Lily's small body into her arms, holding the child close to her chest as she started to sing. An old lullaby came from her lips. It was the same tune her grandmother had taught both her and Elena so many years ago. It was the same song that smelled of chicken soup and star-shaped pasta, and of a love that didn't cost a dime but was worth everything. Lily began to stir. Her eyelids fluttered open, her little fingers twitched, and then they wrapped tightly around Aurora's arm. "Aurora," the word was barely a whisper. "You came back." Aurora kissed Lily's forehead, the tears now falling freely. "I will never leave you again, sweetie. Never." Franco stood in the doorway, just watching the two of them on the bed, his daughter and her cousin. The family that Elena had been trying to give him the whole time. The family he had been too proud and too blind to see. The morning was gray and still. Franco called Margaret into his study. She walked in with her usual smug attitude, expecting to be proven right. But instead, she saw Elena's letter on the desk. All the color drained from her face as she read it. "Get out of my house," Franco said. There was no anger in his voice, just a cold, final decision. "And never come back." Margaret opened her mouth to argue, but Vincent was suddenly at her side, his hand firmly on her arm. "This way, Mrs. Whitmore." She was walked to her car without another word. The main gates shut behind her with a loud, final sound. Inside the mansion, a deep silence fell over the rooms. But for the first time in 23 days, it wasn't a silence of sadness. It was the silence of peace. 6 months later, spring had arrived in Chicago. Bright tulips were blooming in the Castellano gardens bloomed with red, yellow, and purple flowers, a vibrant explosion of color in a place once shadowed by grief. The mansion felt less like a tomb and more like a home. Light streamed in through the windows. Vases of fresh flowers brightened every corner. Best of all, happy sounds now filled the halls that had been gripped by silence. Lily darted across the green lawn, her cheeks pink with happiness, her dark hair flowing freely as she ran. She was trying to catch a butterfly, and her joyful laughter sounded like music in the afternoon air. Back in the kitchen, Aurora was at the stove, gently stirring a pot of soup. She was no longer in a dark blue uniform. A pretty floral dress now graced her frame, and her hair was down, framing her face. The yellow cleaning gloves were a thing of the past. She softly hummed an old lullaby while cooking, dropping star-shaped pasta into the hot broth. She heard him approach, and then felt strong arms gently wrap around her. Franco placed his chin on her shoulder, taking in the wonderful aroma of mint, chicken, and love. "So what makes the soup special today?" he whispered close to her ear. Aurora smiled, a joyful secret in her eyes. "There is an extra star in there today, for a new little addition to our family." Franco stood perfectly still. Aurora turned around to face him. She took his hand and placed it over her stomach, on the gentle swell that had just begun to show. "Lily is going to be a big sister." Franco, the powerful man who had commanded hardened criminals without a second thought, now had tears of happiness streaming down his face. These were not tears of pain or anger, they were tears of pure, overwhelming joy. Before he could find his voice, the kitchen door flew open. "Daddy! Aurora! Look what I got!" Lily rushed inside, her hands cupped around something small. She opened her hands and showed them a beautiful butterfly with orange and black wings. "It just landed on me, like it was magic." Franco swept his daughter up into a big hug, while pulling Aurora in with his other arm. The three of them stood there, bathed in the warm kitchen sunlight. They were a family, brought together not just by relations, but by love, hardship, and the gift of a second chance. On a nearby table, a photograph in a silver frame seemed to be watching them. It was Elena, smiling warmly, her eyes full of peace, as if this was her plan all along. This story shows us that true love cannot be acquired through wealth or influence. The best doctors and the most talented cooks were unable to help Lily, but a simple soup made with genuine care brought her back from the edge. It proves that the most profound miracles often come from very simple things. Family is about more than just blood ties. The connection between Aurora and Lily was stronger than any genetic link. It was a relationship founded on kindness, selflessness, and the willingness to love, even knowing the pain of potential loss. And it shows that it is never too late for redemption. Franco had shielded his heart with pride and sorrow, but when he finally humbled himself and begged for forgiveness, he learned that change is always possible. If you felt a connection to this story, please show your support by clicking the like button and subscribing to our channel for more content like this. Feel free to share this video with anyone who might need a little hope today. We are curious, what is a special comfort food from your family that has the power to soothe your soul? For the Castellanos, it was a special chicken soup. What is yours? Please tell us in the comments below. We truly read every single one, and your personal stories motivate us to continue making videos that bring us all closer together. We appreciate you spending your time with us. We send you our best wishes for good health, happiness, and tranquility in your life. We hope you always manage to find a star to guide you, especially on the darkest nights. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in our next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.